The question was so simple that it should have taken 2 seconds to answer. Do you believe President Trump is honest? That was it. A direct question to the Attorney General of the United States. No legal trap. No classified information. No complicated policy issue. Just a basic test of credibility. And instead of answering, Pam Bondi did what this administration seems to do every time facts get uncomfortable. She dodged, deflected, and tried to bury the truth under a pile of talking points.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Attorney General, for being here today. I want to talk with you about an issue on which there is broad bipartisan agreement: the importance of ensuring trust between the American public and those government officials who wield powerful law enforcement responsibilities. So, Attorney General, would you agree that it is important for law enforcement leaders to be honest?
Of course, as well as members of Congress.
Thank you. And would you include yourself as a law enforcement leader?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You know, President Trump has also, he has referred to himself as the chief law enforcement officer of this country. So do you believe that President Trump is honest?
He is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America, and
not
not only is he keeping this country safe, he is keeping this world safe.
It's a simple question,
of
which
course
you didn't
I do.
answer.
He is
Okay,
the
thank you.
Commander-in-Chief.
Last June, Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman, her husband Mark, and their dog were brutally murdered in their home. And your USA's office in Minnesota investigated this crime and obtained a 6-count indictment of the murder suspect, stating that he had intent to kill, injury, harass, and intimidate Minnesota legislators. And I have the copy right here. I read through it. Yet a few weeks ago, President Trump suggested publicly that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was behind these murders, posting on his Truth Social account a video raising this conspiracy theory. And it wasn't true. And you know it wasn't true, or else you would not have brought an indictment against the subject. Do you know what else Trump has said? He has said he has cut gas prices by 1,400%. False. That he won the 2020 election.
Actually, gas is down to $1.99 a gallon, thanks to President Trump.
That he didn't know Epstein.
Maybe $5 in California.
It's my time, Mr. Chair. That he sent water to LA during the wildfires. False. That Governor Westmore of Maryland called him the greatest president of his lifetime. False. So many tales, too many to keep up. But I want to go back to what he said about Tim Walz. Do you agree that President Trump undermined public trust in law enforcement by suggesting that Governor Walz was involved in the Hortman murders?
I am not familiar with that statement.
Well, that is a disappointing response, and it is also why your office and Donald Trump have zero credibility, because I know, and you know, it was a right-wing extremist who murdered the Hortmans, and you and the president are being dishonest with the American people. Last fall, after the horrific shooting of Charlie Kirk, President Trump was asked if there were extremists on both the left and the right. And his exact words were, "I'll tell you something that's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't care less. The radicals on the right oftentimes are radical because they don't want to see crime. The radicals on the left are the problem, and they're vicious, and they're horrible, and they're politically savvy." Do you agree with this statement? You're taking too long, Madam Attorney General. But you know the answer, because your own department has addressed the question. In 24, the DOJ's research arm issued a report on domestic terrorism, stating that the far number of far-right attacks continues to outpace all other types of terrorism and domestic violence extremists. The DOJ published the report, and after the president made those comments, the DOJ took the report down. And I sent you a letter asking you a simple question. Why did the Justice Department remove the data that shows right-wing extremists have killed more innocent people than left-wing extremists?
Did you refer to immigration enforcement as domestic terrorism?
You should answer my question.
Yes.
You're on my time, but you won't. And what I am asking you to do is put the report back. Restore the data. Stop scrubbing important data from your website. Stop taking down reports that you know the American people need to know about. There are violent, dangerous people out here with real threats, and the dishonesty from your agency comes from the covering up of these threats that could hurt American people and put our lives at rest. Do better. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
May I have one moment?
You may.
Her district includes Culver City, and she's not talking about any crime in her districts. Nothing about helping crime in her district. She's not even worth getting into the details.
But what happened in that hearing room was bigger than one embarrassing moment. Because in just a few minutes, Bondi exposed something far more serious than political loyalty. She showed exactly how this White House handles reality when the facts stop helping them. And once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. The exchange started with a simple setup. A member of Congress pointed out that Trump has repeatedly referred to himself as the chief law enforcement officer of the country. That matters because Bondi is supposed to be the nation's top law enforcement official. Her job is not to protect a politician's image. Her job is to protect the truth, uphold the law, and defend public trust. So when she was asked if Trump is honest, this should have been the easiest answer of her career if she truly believed in him. Instead, she immediately swerved. She started talking about him being commander-in-chief. She pivoted to gas prices. She tried to make it about safety and crime. Anything except the question she was actually asked. And in that moment, everyone watching saw the same thing. She could not bring herself to say yes, because even she knew how ridiculous that would sound. That's what made the moment so revealing. Because sometimes what a person refuses to say tells you more than what they actually say. Bondi wasn't being cautious because she needed to protect a legal position. She was being cautious because she knew the facts were against her. If she said Trump was honest, she'd instantly be tied to every false claim he's made. If she said she didn't know, that would sound absurd. If she said no, it would be political suicide. So she chose the only option left. Pretend the question never existed. That may work in a press release, but in a hearing room, under direct questioning, it looked exactly like what it was. Panic. And the reason that question mattered so much is because it came in the middle of a much larger issue. The hearing quickly moved into one of the most disturbing examples of misinformation tied to Trump in recent months. The false conspiracy theory surrounding the murders of Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark. This wasn't some random rumor floating around online. This was a horrific real-life tragedy involving the deaths of public officials. The suspect had already been identified. Bondi's own Justice Department had already brought a 6-count indictment. The facts were clear. Investigators said the suspect acted with intent to kill, injure, harass, and intimidate Minnesota legislators. That should have been the end of the story. But instead of respecting the facts, Trump pushed a completely different narrative. He shared content suggesting that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was somehow connected to the killings. Think about how reckless that is. A sitting president using his platform to amplify a baseless theory about an active murder case that his own administration had already helped solve. That is not just irresponsible. That is dangerous. It undermines the public's faith in law enforcement. It spreads fear, and it puts innocent people at risk. So lawmakers asked Bondi whether Trump had damaged public trust by spreading that lie. And once again, she refused to engage honestly. Her response? She claimed she wasn't familiar with the statement. That answer was almost more shocking than the dodge about honesty. Because this was not some obscure comment buried in a local paper. This was a major public controversy involving a murder case, the president's own social media post, and a false accusation against a sitting governor. Bondi is the Attorney General. If anyone in America should know whether the president is spreading misinformation about a high-profile criminal case, it's her. So either she was lying when she said she wasn't familiar, or she was admitting she's not even aware of one of the biggest stories involving her own department. Neither option is reassuring, and what made this even darker was the human impact. Governor Tim Walz later spoke publicly about how Trump's post affected the Hortman family. He said the children of the murdered couple were being put at risk all over again because of these false rumors. Imagine losing your parents in a brutal act of violence, only to watch the most powerful people in the country use their deaths as political fuel. That's not politics. That's cruelty. Walz didn't mince words. He said it was evil. And honestly, it's hard to disagree. Because this is what happens when truth stops mattering. Real people pay the price. But that wasn't the only example lawmakers brought up. In fact, the hearing quickly turned into a broader examination of Trump's repeated public falsehoods. And this is where Bondi's refusal to answer the honesty question became even more glaring. Because once you start listing the claims Trump has made, it becomes obvious why she wanted no part of endorsing his credibility. One of the first examples raised was his repeated claim that gas prices had fallen to $1.99 a gallon because of his policies. Trump even went so far as to suggest prices had dropped by 1,400%. That's not just exaggerated. That's mathematically impossible. Let's be clear about this. A 1,400% reduction would mean gas didn't just become cheap. It would mean people were effectively being paid to fill their tanks. That's how absurd the claim is. And yet it was said confidently, repeated publicly, and treated by supporters as fact. The real data told a completely different story. Gas prices had fluctuated over time for a range of reasons, including global supply, seasonal demand, refinery issues, and broader economic trends. But nowhere in the actual numbers was there anything remotely close to the fantasy Trump described. So when Bondi was asked about honesty, this is what was hanging over the room. Not just one exaggeration, a whole pattern. Then came the 2020 election. This is perhaps the clearest example of why the honesty question mattered. Years later, Trump still repeats the claim that he won the election. That claim has been tested in courts, audited by election officials, examined by Republican and Democratic authorities alike, and rejected again and again. In Georgia alone, Republican officials confirmed the results multiple times. Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, publicly said Trump lost. Judges across the country threw out challenge after challenge because there was no credible evidence. Yet the claim never stopped. Why? Because the goal was never to prove anything. The goal was to create enough confusion that people stop trusting the system itself. That is what makes disinformation so effective. It doesn't have to convince everyone. It just has to make enough people uncertain, enough people cynical, enough people exhausted. Once that happens, facts lose their power. Reality becomes optional. And that is incredibly dangerous in a democracy. Because if people stop believing elections are real, courts are fair, or evidence matters, then the entire system starts to break down. Bondi knows that. She's a lawyer. She understands how institutions work, which is why her refusal to answer honestly about Trump's honesty was so telling. She knew exactly what she was being asked to defend. The hearing also brought up another example that perfectly captured this pattern. Trump's false claim that Maryland Governor Wes Moore had called him the greatest president of his lifetime. Trump presented it like a personal endorsement from a rising Democratic governor. But when Moore was asked directly about it, he shut it down immediately. He said Trump was lying. He even joked that the real breaking news was that the president lies. Moore explained what actually happened. Trump had complimented him personally and offered help on infrastructure issues, but there was never anything close to the glowing endorsement Trump later described. Why does that matter? Because it shows how casually these false narratives are created. A private conversation gets twisted into a fake public validation. A vague interaction becomes a headline-friendly boast. And if nobody pushes back hard enough, that version becomes reality for millions of people. That's the danger of having leaders who treat the truth like a branding tool. Every fact becomes negotiable. Every statement becomes a performance. And once that culture spreads into the Justice Department, the stakes become much higher than politics. That brings us to what may have been the most serious part of the hearing: the removal of Justice Department research on domestic terrorism. This issue got less attention than Bondi's dodge, but it may be the most important thing that happened. Lawmakers asked Bondi about a report published by the DOJ's own research arm, the National Institute of Justice. That report found something deeply significant. Far-right extremists had committed more ideologically motivated killings in the United States than any other domestic extremist group over the last several decades. Not by a little, by a wide margin. The numbers were stark. Since 1990, far-right extremists were linked to hundreds of attacks and more than 500 deaths. Far-left extremists and other ideological groups accounted for far fewer deadly incidents. This was not partisan speculation. This was the Justice Department's own research based on years of evidence. It mattered because understanding where threats actually come from is essential for public safety. Law enforcement needs facts, not narratives. Communities need transparency, not spin. But shortly after a high-profile shooting involving conservative activist Charlie Kirk, that report disappeared from the DOJ website. Think about that for a second. A government agency publishes evidence showing a long-term trend in domestic terrorism. Then, after a politically sensitive incident, the report is quietly removed. That should set off alarms for everyone, regardless of politics. Because once government starts deleting inconvenient data, accountability starts to disappear with it. Lawmakers asked Bondi a straightforward question: why was the report taken down? And instead of addressing the substance, she tried to redirect the conversation into a political argument about immigration enforcement. It was a textbook deflection. That moment may have been the clearest example of the real issue here. Because the problem is not just that officials are dodging questions. The problem is that they appear willing to erase facts when those facts become inconvenient. This is not about disagreeing over policy. People can debate how to handle extremism, crime, or national security. That's normal in a democracy. But deleting research, refusing to answer direct questions, and pretending public statements never happened? That's something else entirely. That's an attack on the public's ability to know what is real. And that's why Bondi's performance in this hearing matters so much. She was not acting like an independent attorney general serving the Constitution. She was acting like a political shield. Every answer was designed to protect a narrative, not to inform the public. Every dodge made the same point without saying it directly. The truth was too risky to acknowledge. That is a dangerous place for a country to be. Because institutions only work when people believe they are grounded in something bigger than loyalty. The Justice Department is supposed to be one of the last places where facts still matter, even when they're inconvenient. Instead, what people saw in that hearing was something very different. They saw an attorney general unable to answer whether the president tells the truth. They saw her pretend not to know about a major conspiracy theory involving a murder case her own department prosecuted. They saw her refuse to explain why crucial terrorism data vanished. And they saw her fall back on talking points instead of answers every single time the facts got uncomfortable. That's not confidence. That's not leadership. That's fear. And fear is exactly what drives this kind of behavior. Fear of upsetting the president. Fear of breaking ranks. Fear of telling the truth in a political environment where loyalty is valued more than honesty. But here's the thing. Fear at the top creates danger for everyone below. When leaders stop respecting facts, it becomes harder for law enforcement to do its job, harder for journalists to report the truth, harder for voters to make informed decisions, and harder for families already suffering to get justice without being dragged into political theater. That is why moments like this matter. Not because of the viral clip, not because of the headlines, but because they reveal what kind of system we are actually living under. A healthy government can survive criticism. It can survive hard questions. It can survive uncomfortable truths. In fact, that's how it gets stronger. But a government that panics at basic accountability, a government that scrubs reports and dodges reality, that's a government showing weakness, not strength at let's go back to where this started. Do you believe President Trump is honest? It was a yes or no question. Pam Bondi had every opportunity to answer it. She didn't. And in that silence, in that awkward pivot, in that obvious discomfort, she told the country everything it needed to know. Because when someone whose job is to defend the truth cannot bring herself to vouch for the person in charge, that says more than any prepared statement ever could. If they can't answer the easy questions, imagine what they're hiding behind the hard ones. And if they're willing to erase data, twist tragedies, and dodge facts in public, what are they doing when nobody's watching? That's the real story here. Not just that Bondi panicked in a hearing, but that her panic exposed a much bigger crisis of trust, truth, and accountability in America right now. That if you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that powerful people hope you'll ignore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.